Hello and welcome to tonight's Baumer Conversation. It's September 23rd and I'm John Davis. In the new reimagined format for this year's guest speakers, we will listen to our guest presentation and then have the opportunity to talk about the work. As always, please submit your questions through the comments function at the bottom of the live stream. Tonight I'm joined by Sara Zewde. Sara is a landscape designer, urbanist, and public artist. She joins us from New York, where she is the principal and founder of Studio Zewde, a practice that uses a wide variety of media to make interventions into both the landscape and the city. Her work has garnered a number of awards and has been exhibited in the 2016 and 2018 Venice Biennale in both the U.S. and Brazilian pavilions. Sara has held a number of prestigious fellowships as well, including being named the 2014 National Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation and the 2016 Artist in Residence at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. Sara holds a BA in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University, a Master's in City Planning from MIT, and a Master's in Landscape Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I met her and had the pleasure of being her TA, what seems like ages ago now. Sara has recently returned to Cambridge after stints teaching at the University of Texas, Austin, and Columbia University, taking up an appointment as a professor of practice at the GSD. We're very happy to have her with us tonight, where I feel like I'm getting a chance to catch up with an old friend. Sara, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is really wonderful to see a familiar face, albeit through the screen. And I would just want to start by saying thank you for the invitation. I so wish it could have been in person, but I'm still, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this work and be in dialogue with you, John, and with the community at the Knowlton School. So thank you for having me. I'll share my screen for presentation. So, I really want to start the presentation, this being my first time there, with an introduction about kind of what is it that frames the work that I'm doing and the sort of central inquiry into all of the kind of range of activities that I'm engaged in. For me, my sort of intellectual formation started on August 29, 2005, 15 years ago, almost to the day, to the month, when I watched a storm brew and barrel towards my home state of Louisiana. And I watched this event from a dorm room in Boston. And it was really the aftermath of this event that prompted my investigation into, the disciplinary realms that could tackle the political, the ecological, the cultural and aesthetic, the economic factors that manifest something like a Hurricane Katrina. And, I found my way, they took the scenic route, but I found my way to landscape architecture. And I'm so compelled by the range of skills that this discipline gives to both analyze and intervene in the world around us. And so I am engaged in a range of activities that I don't see as being parallel to one another. In fact, I work hard to, kind of create a feedback loop between these different modes of working, such that they are compounding each other and challenging and evolving each other. So I'll share pieces of some of these activities and give you a sense of how we're working to push some ideas forward. And as John mentioned, I'm principal of Studio Zewde. We are a landscape architecture firm based in New York City on Lenox Avenue, also known as Malcolm X Avenue in Harlem. So open invitation to you all whenever travel and visiting is a thing again to come see us in our storefront facing Lenox Avenue. So in the office, we talk about our design methodology as being powered by site interpretation, cultural narrative, and a dedication to the craft of construction. The idea here is that, we are big thinkers. We're thinking outside of the limits of work that our projects give us. We're really reading larger political and ecological contexts within which our projects sit. We are culling root narratives, cultural narratives, to help us determine priorities and design moves and organization. And we're taking those ideas and committing to them through the detail and construction phases. In other words, the actual crafting of a built landscape is really where these ideas matter, where they come to fruition. And that innovation and big thinking really can help you make decisions about material hierarchies, or how materials come together and how to turn a corner. And it's the expression of those materials in the built landscape that makes something feel like it fits, or makes someone feel like they belong in this world. And that's a big statement, but that is kind of the hypothesis that we work on every project to test and evolve. When I wrote a master's thesis at MIT on a concept that I was working through called Black urbanism. In that work, I came across this essay by Bell Hooks in a magazine, ironically called Lenox Avenue, where our office sits today. But in an essay called The Aesthetic of Blackness, Strange and Oppositional. And in it, she describes an aesthetic of being. And it's kind of a throwaway phrase in a line, in a sentence, but she's describing the women in her life growing up, the Black women in her life who fashioned what she called an aesthetic of being. And for me, it made me reflect heavily and continue to reflect on the idea that, if being itself is a political act, that's, particularly if you are a woman, or you're racialized or gendered, or a Southerner or poor, or what have you, that being itself is a political act. And so, designing a world, a landscape that is supportive of your being, what is that aesthetic? And that is kind of a driving force in our design explorations. But whose being can we support in the fashioning of an aesthetic? And so these questions are questions that we explore in the context of a range of different project types, project scales, and geographies across the country. And so I'll just take you through kind of a snapshot of some of our more recent work. This one is actually a little bit, a few years prior, but I know that we're speaking to a community that's, of the whole School of Architecture, and I wanted to include a kind of a diversity of project types. This is a streetscape project in Houston, Texas, on Genesee Street. This is a community that was built by freed slaves just after emancipation, who traveled from the West down the Brazos River, from the Brazos River cotton plantations, and they constructed this neighborhood on the Buffalo Bayou in a part of town that at the time was unsettled, but because of its really clayey soils, it was prone to flooding, really thick bayou vegetation. And they built their own homes. They cleared the vegetation. They formed their own bricks. They paved their own streets. They developed their own stormwater system. All of these things that the city of Houston at the time would not provide for them. So we're talking about this plot of land here. It's very close to the historic center, the historic downtown of Houston. They even left some lots undeveloped on purpose in order to function, to serve two dual functions at the same time. One was to hold water and mitigate flooding. And at the same time, they used the brush from the vegetation to create these shade structures. And so the sites doubled as places of gathering and of preaching and worship. And so eventually this neighborhood became the heart of civic Black Houston, home to teachers and shop owners and doctors and lawyers. And the neighborhood over time became victim to a lot of what a lot of neighborhoods in the urban core are witness to. Urban renewal, a freeway bisecting the neighborhood, public removal of housing to build public housing, and then of late, the development pressure being located near the historic core. So this is about 9 years ago now. I was working for a small landscape architecture firm that was subcontracted by civil engineers who were working to reconstruct. There was some flooding issues, and they wanted to reconstruct some of the sewers on Genesee Street, a 60-foot wide right-of-way. On the left, you see kind of the historic grid, and on the right, you see the scale at which urban renewal has been at work here over time. When we started the project, the engineers kind of asked us landscape architects. I mean, they really just wanted us to tell them where to put the trees. 30 foot on center, where are the curb lines, what benches are you going to spec? And they were like, oh, maybe you can put a plaque to talk about the history of this place, or I don't know, maybe can you put like African symbols in the paving? And I was like, no. So I took the opportunity to kind of delve into this question a little bit more about how could this place be expressive of the history and culture, something that the residents themselves had been communicating as a priority. So I started by looking at the architecture of the place, and a number of architectural historians have talked about this, but piecing this together with Freedmanstown in the 4th Ward. So this is the architecture that you find in the neighborhood, historic architecture that you find in the neighborhood today. Essentially, there's a West African antecedent among the Yoruba that was brought to Haiti during, by enslaved people. And then during the Haitian Revolution, they brought this architectural type to New Orleans, from where it spread through the bayous of Southeast Texas, and it's made its way to the Buffalo Bayou. What's notable about this architectural type is that the short end of the home is facing the street. And so it optimizes the number of families that have a presence on the street, and creates this kind of gallery effect with the ubiquity of porches and steps and walls, and there's this kind of blurring between the private space of the interior of the home and the public space of the street. And when people talk about their memories of this place, it's really this punctuated, blurred gallery of public/private places that people associate most strongly with what makes this place memorable in their hearts and minds. So I went out and documented the patterns created by the doors and the steps and the porches, while some of these structures still exist. Many of them are under threat of being removed and redeveloped. Also took stock of the paving pattern that the original settlers laid. So along the straightaway of the roadway, there's this sort of orthogonal pattern that at the intersections, that pattern breaks and forms this diagonal. And the elders, really just hanging out on the street, had so much to share about this neighborhood, and shared that the settlers were, they did this specifically to mark the intersections as a space of ritual, something that was done in West Africa, practice that they brought from West Africa. So in our little streetscape project, I saw the opportunity to concentrate the bricks that were salvageable and place them at the intersections, again, raising the profile. Quite literally, actually, we proposed tabled crosswalks to raise the profile of the crosswalk. And there's a school here that asked us to include a site wall and seating and site furnishings. And so we, instead of a wall, essentialized the kind of dimensions of the shotgun architectural type, and used that. I mean, we proposed a really simple material of concrete, really modest color of black, to speak to the modesty of the structures, original structures that the settlers built. And we modeled the artificial and sunlight, natural light, in order to understand what kinds of patterns these cutout, doors and windows and panels would cast on the street. And proposed actually casting the concrete itself using the wood panels from the structures as they're removed, so that the walls are actually functioning as a sort of grain of the original structures. The planting itself became part of this spatial storytelling, using a plant palette that's speaking to the vegetation that the original settlers worked to clear. kind of a, when we started down this project and started to develop this concept, this school here actually suggested that we elaborate this idea further onto some of their property. And so we developed this idea of the sanctuary, where we wanted to actually propose a curbless street profile here, but basically the Public Works Department wasn't really having it. But on this private property, it was something that we could explore. And so we actually integrated the idea of the brush arbors as a place of gathering together with bioswales on this school property. So people that are displaced from the neighborhood actually have this sanctuary place under the brush arbors to gather and to also mitigate flooding. And even elements like the lighting, the walls themselves function as the kind of seating that was required of this project. So instead of an off-the-shelf bench, the porches themselves are functioning as a way to, beyond a plaque, are telling the story of the history of this neighborhood by prompting the kind of uses the place has been witnessed to over time. The lighting itself being warm and backlighting, working to evoke the feeling and the complex associations of memory and loss that are embodied by this place. And so this is a streetscape project, right? Using the traditional media of landscape architecture, of site furnishings, of trash receptacles, of vegetation and lighting and curbs and stormwater. But all of those banal elements of the urban landscape are opportunities to tell stories. And so working kind of at a different scale, this is a more recent project. We finished the concept plan for this project last year, 2019, for the Mander Recreation Center campus in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is a 22-acre site that's part of the larger Fairmount Park system in Strawberry Mansion, which is just north of downtown Philadelphia. In a neighborhood that's seen a lot of disinvestment. It's the high school there is considered one of the most dangerous high schools in the United States, and the park then is a place to form really critical intergenerational relationships, mentorship, after school programs. Sports are a huge part of what brings people together. This place is really, people describe as the community's front yard. So our process working here was interesting, in part because Reservoir Drive here is considered kind of the separation between the residents of Strawberry Mansion, who are 98% Black, and what's considered the white part of the park on the other side of Reservoir Drive, where it has more of a regional draw and is generally used by white people in the region. And so Reservoir Drive has kind of always been this dividing line, and if you see the amenities of the park, existing amenities of the park, all concentrated on the southeast portion of the site. That is, we learned the legacy of Philadelphia having both a parks department and a rec department. The parks department generally overseeing the interiors of the park and being staffed with white people, and the rec department rather being staffed with Black people historically, and having kind of purview of the edges of the park. And they're now one entity, but this legacy still remains in the built landscape. Part of when we walked into the project, what we wanted to do and what we do a lot is to look at archival materials and actually share that with community members, so to start a conversation about memory and understand people's connections to this place. So sharing these images really opened people up to the process and started them on a journey of storytelling and sharing with us what's important about this place. One community member shared this poem with us. It says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" And this idea of a monument that breathes really actually became a conceptual departure for us. Can the park itself be a monument that breathes? So our first community touch point, we never have community meetings. We always call them events in order to kind of crack open the format of what can it possibly be. Before we had anything drawn, we had a block party. We know that we learned that in this neighborhood, block parties are kind of a big part of what the neighborhood is known for. So we had a block party celebrating the neighborhood the way it is today, the park as it is today. We called it an I Love Mander party. There was, t-shirt making and games and we had barbecue and a DJ and rappers from the neighborhood rapping about what they love about the park. And at a certain point, we switched out the barbecue for large aerial maps, and we had the 150 party goers. One of the kind of games was we broke everybody up into 6 groups, and they made collages about what they love about this place. And, that kind of broke down the sort of binary of us as the designers and them. They were kind of mixed in. Nobody knew who we were. And the 6 groups then had to present to the larger group their collage, and gave us a chance to listen to people articulate their priorities and what was important. And then we did a very scientific analysis of those collages. The idea of interpreting these was really not about a one-to-one analysis of, there's a picture of bike parking here, therefore there should be bike parking in the project, but really an understanding of what are the emerging themes here. And we came up with 3 that we saw consistently throughout the 6 collages. One was activating this residential edge of 33rd Street. Second was bringing people into the heart of the campus. And third was forming a clear and legible circulation system around the park. And so we were able to very clearly then share how those 3 emerging themes from these collages actually formed the structure of the landscape plan that we had developed. With regard to Reservoir Drive and this sort of separation here, we decided to honor the fact that the southeast corner is the heart of the Strawberry Mansion community, and we didn't want to walk away from the fact that that is people's lived experience of this place. At the same time, from a circulation perspective, we actually proposed 2 mid-block crossings, and all of the circulation is actually, supportive of safe and accessible crossing. However, the topography is reflective of the way that people experience the site, which is that this is the heart of this community. And we did an and both treatment of that. We also develop what we call a memory plan. In other words, all of the memories that people shared with us about this place, we wanted to be clear about how what we were proposing not only preserved it, but actually bolstered it into the future, and that we're supporting and anchoring the people that are here into the future of the park. John Coltrane actually grew up on 33rd Street facing the park. And so there was a question of how to memorialize John Coltrane. On the left is a sketch that he did of the mathematics of jazz music. And so we interpreted that sketch into a paving pattern over the course of the park, of the site. And that paving pattern then became an armature for wayfinding and opportunity for inscriptions about a number of the notable people throughout the neighborhood. And at the heart of the park, that southeast corner where you're looking out into this sort of bowl-shaped topography, hugging the spectacle of sports and community in the central field, we proposed a water feature with the words of the poem about the breathing monument inscribed, so that as you're reflecting on the words of the poem of the breathing monument, you're actually taking in the sights of the breathing monument being the community itself. So this is another project actually in Philadelphia, and we are wrapping up the concept phase now, called Graffiti Pier. I think this is the last of the projects that I'll share. This is a 6-acre waterfront site on the Delaware River. It's Pier 18 and Pier 20. And it has a really interesting history in that, following the Lanai Lenape settlement that had been here for thousands of years, this area became a railroad depot connected to the coal industry in Pennsylvania. In the 1970s, with the decline of coal, that actually coincides in time with the invention of graffiti, which actually was invented in Philadelphia. They would love to tell you all about that New York did not invent graffiti. And so with the coincidence of those two moments of history, this site actually fell out of use by the railroad, and essentially fell into a heavy use by graffiti writers, and that has been the case for decades now. And what happened in 2010 was Instagram, and it became the most Instagram spot in Philadelphia and kind of rose out of beyond the sort of underground culture of street art and graffiti. And today it remains a really dynamic and active, outdoor street art museum. But with so much foot traffic now, it became a liability for the property owners of Conrail, and they, started to inquire about whether the city or our client, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation, would want to purchase it and develop it into something. So we were commissioned by the DRWC to develop a vision plan for the site. Our pitch was essentially, centered on the idea that the users of the site are have been criminalized for the value and that they've imbued in this place and the beauty that they've imbued in this place. And in fact, some of them are literally behind bars for that. And so our public engagement strategy would be twofold. One would be public, the other would not be public, in that, there's a sense of anonymity that this culture thrives on. People have monikers and day jobs. And so we propose centering this non-public participation process in the development of the project. One of the things that was important for us to share with the graffiti writers who have a significant relationship to the site was that, by 2050, the site will be submerged daily just by rising tides. And that was important to understand because for the most part, they didn't want us to touch anything. When we asked, what do you want this project to be about? They're like, can you do nothing? And the reality is we can't if you want to save the site. We started to reframe the project as a Save Graffiti Pier project. And not only is there pressure coming from the water side, but from the land side, the urban development pressures are encroaching this place on every side. So sharing this information with graffiti writers meant we were going to bars. We had a bar tab. We were, getting anonymous phone calls and emails and working through people's representatives. And it was quite the journey. It has been quite the journey, a fun one, working with them. So all in the range of conversations that we had with folks, we asked everybody the same question. We asked, what is the best thing that can happen in Graffiti Pier, and what is the worst thing that can happen in Graffiti Pier? And we started to chart all of the responses that we had in these disparate conversations. What we saw was that the best thing that could happen here is just leave it untouched, and the worst was, a new park. And we again essentialized these into some pretty clear design guidelines that we said, okay, if does this resonate with what you've told us? Because we're going to move forward with these, if so. One was ensuring the continuation and expansion of art. Second was keeping the site vegetated and passive. 3, make it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible. And 4 was keeping it gritty. So with those design guidelines kind of checked off after we circled back to them, we basically were able to communicate pretty clearly at a site diagram scale how we were going to implement these design guidelines that came from these conversations. For instance, keeping it gritty. When they describe what gritty means, it actually, the ecosystem of graffiti happens to intersect quite well with an intertidal ecosystem. Grit to them was mud, water, plants, vegetation, right? So this was an opportunity for us to break down the bulkhead and introduce a dynamic intertidal wetland landscape that both buffers the site from the water, from the rising tides. It allows the vegetation to encroach upland over time, but also gives a vegetative buffer around the site, blocking it from view of the development that's happening on the adjacent parcels. We then made renderings and shared those ideas back to the graffiti writers, and they actually tagged their feedback. And so we had to code their tags and work their feedback back into the plan, and then worked in the detail scale at the section scale, integrating those ideas of bioretention with the elements of art. And, so for instance, a lot of what we're doing may not visually look dissimilar from what's there, but we are introducing a more robust and sustainable planting palette. We're introducing some ADA accessible surfacing, and reinforcing of these otherwise crumbling infrastructures. And even things like site furnishings then, are opportunities for expansion of art. So we started to develop some custom site furnishing that is also a canvas for the continued creation of street art and graffiti. So just to give you a sense of some before and afters, this is the before and this is after with the bioretention swale, upgraded surfacing, ADA accessible surfacing. This is before this platform area, our introduction of seating. That's also art surfaces and some shade. This is before and this is after. Again, really just working with the plant palette itself and making it more robust. This is the top level of one of the trestles. People are climbing up here, so we're actually introducing a ramp, an ADA accessible ramp. People said, do not make this the High Line, and they did not want, they just didn't want the kind of tropes of a park. So we actually don't ever call it a park. We always talk about a publicly accessible place that feels found. So, you know, talking about sedums and grasses here. So that's kind of a selection of some of the projects in the office. I did want to share with the last couple of minutes that I have here some research work that I think is an interesting frame also on kind of how I started the presentation talking about how I ended up in this profession. Because this research that I'm doing now really brings me full circle and really has been giving me confidence about what I think landscape architecture is capable of. So this work that I'm doing is a look at the period in Frederick Law Olmsted Sr.'s life that predates Central Park. This is 1852. He's hired by the New York Times to travel to slave states and write about the conditions of slavery. A period in his life that I believe is under-historicized in our understanding of his legacy in landscape architecture. Among historians, there's no doubt about the significance of this work. He's considered the most cited witness of 19th century slavery. But among landscape architects, we've done less to historicize this dimension of his biography and its impact on the practice of landscape architecture. So I've had the privilege through fellowship at Dunbar and Oaks and support from the Graham Foundation to spend some time revisiting his writing from then, what was then the New York Daily Times. And think about this sort of historiography of Olmsted as well. So, you know, oftentimes when we learn about his biography, we're told that he had a period of his life that he was a journalist, and subsequently he became a landscape architect, right? So this is kind of a summary of his work as a journalist, including Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, which actually predates Cotton Kingdom. And then we learn that he becomes a landscape architect. He submits a design competition entry with Vox for Central Park and oversees the project, and then goes on to establish a firm and work all over North America. When we look at these events over time, however, we actually see that they are in fact happening at the same time. He's going back and forth between these various activities, and in fact, he submits a resignation to the Central Park Commission, steps down from his position as superintendent in order to revisit and rewrite his work on the South in advance of what he sees as an impending civil war. And so we have to understand, if we're going to understand, if we accept Olmsted as the father of this profession, understanding the historical context of the birth of the profession itself, I think, is critical to also to thinking about our profession today and what we're living through today and what we're capable of, what he thought was capable for this profession and what we might envision 165 years later. So, you know, he wrote contemporaneously for the New York Times, but he publishes it again in a 3-volume set, and then he republishes it a third time in his most staunchly abolitionist voice. Over time, he's just becoming less and less apologetic about slavery, and that's when he steps down from Central Park and writes what he would go on to call the Cotton Kingdom. And so I revisited his letters, as well as the New York Daily Times writings, as well as the Cotton Kingdom publishing, and retraced his steps for 4 months last year, 2019. What I took from visiting those sites was that, the physical conditions of what he describes have changed drastically in most cases. But the economic and social conditions of what he describes are very persistent. And what's ironic is oftentimes the tool that's used to recast the physical conditions of these sites has been landscape architecture and architecture. And so in an ironic twist of fate, it's actually the profession that Olmsted advocated so heartily for that has been the tool or weapon of untelling the stories he wanted to tell about this country. And he had this faith. He comes back to the North following his travels, and he believes that civic ground and civicness is so corroded by the idea of owning humans. He's actually concerned about the ability of the society to re-stitch itself together in a post-abolition world. And he's so convinced that the idea of civic ground and civicness is critical to the post-abolition world that he commits himself to the project of landscape architecture. And so, you know, to me, this book and his writing is not just a historical document, but it's a methodological proposition for design about how to read and operate the larger contexts of the world, and then zoom into a site and think about the conditions of the land, of the soil, of the light qualities, of the social interactions that happen on the surface. And the toggling back and forth between those different scales and modes of operating are so ripe. There's so much potential in that for us, I think, even as we consider what's possible today. So, I have this one last observation I'll leave you with. You probably never thought that Olmsted and Malcolm X would be on the same slide, but there's a reason. And Malcolm X, in his autobiography, he actually says, you know, it's books like that of Frederick Law Olmsted that opened my eyes to the conditions that were suffered by slaves that were landed in the United States. And it really like calls attention to this, an expanded notion of the impact of the landscape architect. That, you know, we can think really broadly about what we do and what our impact is. And ironically, the roots of the origin of the profession itself have a lot to say potentially about what the future is of the profession. That's that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Just give us a second while we reorient screens here. Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for this talk. This is wonderful to see some really astounding and really sensitive work, some design work, but then also the opportunity to kind of do a question the profession's origins and the kind of intellectual foundations of the profession, and really bring up what I think are incredibly important questions about, you know, why is so much of this history missing, and what can we begin to do about this kind of erasure? So, I do want to talk more about your, the impact of this on your biography as someone who has taken the scenic route to landscape architecture, like Frederick Law Olmsted, also took a scenic route to Frederick Law Olmsted, but also your biography as a Southerner, as a Black woman, also in a profession that has typically been white. I want to ask that, but I wanted to ask before we get into that, I wanted you to reflect a little bit on how the education of landscape architects has, in your kind of seeing it taught in several different places at this point, has been subject to kind of losing its origins or losing its roots. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
It's a good question, and I'm still wrapping my head around why there is this odd silence around the Cotton Kingdom text. I think Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England is very frequently referenced, which to me feels actually less relevant to landscape architecture, to his practice of landscape architecture. It's a curious omission, and I've asked the faculty that trained me, and there's no clear answer. Although I've learned that it's taken a lot of time to actually arrive at even appointing Frederick Law Olmsted as the father of the profession. It wasn't always understood that that was the case. And so there's a piecing together of his legacy that's happened over time. And maybe this is, one of the last big pieces to really be incorporated into the story of landscape architecture. We're a young profession, so there is a lot of work to do, and we're a small profession. So I guess the reason I even embarked on this journey, all I did when I was a student is I heard in passing about his travels in the South, and I asked my professors, what could I read to learn more about it? When there was really not much for me to read, I was like, I think I'm gonna have to write it. But if the book had existed, I would have read the book and I would have continued on with my life, and I wouldn't be talking about this right now. But it is an auto mission, and I think it could be really fruitful for us.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. It's funny, and because I've done a little work on Olmsted myself, and it's funny how every generation seems to kind of rediscover Olmsted in a way. Well, I do want to talk more about that, but I was struck by this kind of idea, your thesis that you mentioned at the end of your talk about how you are interested in formulating a kind of or using Olmsted's work to kind of further a methodological proposition for design that might be different from how design operates nowadays. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe link it with what I see as a big emphasis on interpretation of sites. So arriving to a site and then what are the methods you use to interpret that site. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I thought this question might come up, so I have a slide, actually. I don't know if is it too late for me to share my screen again? Am I allowed to?
We'll give it a shot.
Okay. See if it works.
Give it a minute here while in the control booth,
Okay. Well, I can start talking about it. It is about interpretation, and it's interesting looking at the text from a kind of a literary perspective, what he chooses to describe about these places. There's a lot of direct dialogue that he's documenting, particularly between Olmsted and enslaved people. And so it's clear from the things he chooses to describe, the soil, the vegetation, the topography, the accents of people, the word choice. The layers of analysis that he chooses to call forward, I think, are so fascinating and are kind of a framework for landscape architecture. And beyond that, I think there's a scalar proposition. This is a map that Olmsted himself and a man named Daniel Goodloe, who was an abolitionist in North Carolina, they worked together to make this, to do this analysis using census data from 1850. And so this kind of like large spatial analysis that we all are so familiar with, these are methods that have been around for a long time, and it's so fascinating to me to think about it like that. But this map was made in order to support his assertion of that basically to challenge the economic argument for slavery. And what this map is doing is looking at the concentrations of enslaved people and how the economic health of the region and how those things are actually oppositional to one another. And the reason he's making this argument is he's saying there's not an economic argument driving this. It's actually there's an intoxicated logic about this, and therefore the solution for him is being supportive of civic culture and civic life. And so the ability to toggle then between this kind of larger reading and then zoom in on a site in South Carolina and talk to a human, an enslaved human, and work through those conversations about what makes this place so important and special and evocative and memorable, is important. It's important for us to not think about our projects and particularly in practice as just within the boundaries of this limit of work that we're given, but to be able to conduct this kind of analysis as we think about what's possible within our sites.
That's really interesting because showing this map is and showing kind of Olmsted's big picture kind of sociological view of the United States or the South as this thing is really kind of interesting, and I can see how his outlook has influenced you. But I'm also curious about how your kind of personal philosophy of site interpretation leads you to uncover that amazing John Coltrane drawing, and then understand that as it's very kind of, I think it's very kind of fluid and beautiful the way you see that there's a culture here, there's a place here. Coltrane's of this place, that means this drawing is of this place, and that means that it relates to the landscape somehow. So I think it's a wildly successful kind of intervention, but I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of philosophy behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess not having said it explicitly, it's probably clear that memory is a big part of a lot of how we work, and the idea being that that memory is not necessarily a discrete moment in the past, but it is, the landscape is a palimpsest of memory, and being cognizant of all of those layers, particularly when they're not expressed in the built environment in some places versus others, is really important to me. And I think this is where my biography probably comes into play. I'm very cognizant of the fact that I often don't see myself in the built environment. Stories about people like myself, people that look like me. And so I am, always looking for opportunities to express people's identities and cultures and ways of life beyond, the plaque, beyond the statue, beyond the kind of tropes of architecture as it traditionally deals with memory, but really, in everyday life, how can you validate someone's existence, and that's why I love landscape architecture. We're just talking about like sidewalks and parks and plazas, but that's the stuff of life. That's what makes somebody feel like they belong in walking down the street, or feel safe on the street corner, or, whatever, what have you. And I think memory is often the key to unlocking a lot of that, when your history is not expressed in the built landscape, you have a different relationship to memory. You use art and culture and ritual and storytelling and hip hop and whatever. And so a lot of arts and culture and our ways, like John Coltrane's story, are ways, they're entry points into thinking about memory.
Yeah, and it's, which is why the suggestion from the engineers that, we'll just put a plaque up is so, it's like, yeah. So I want to remind our viewers that you can submit questions on YouTube, and those will be fed to me. And I have one here actually that kind of fits in well with what we've just been talking about. This is from Dorothée Imbert, and she says, and I quote here, "Thank you. So much of the work you present relies on mining memory. And if design is a moment in time, so much of landscape architecture relies on maintenance. Mm-hmm. How do you allow for change while retaining memory?"
That's a great question. I think the Graffiti Pier project is an interesting example of that. That change, is inherent to any place, as you've described, but especially a site like Graffiti Pier on the Delaware River, in an intertidal landscape. And so making people comfortable with the idea of change and identifying what it is that's important to them to preserve is, that was a lot of our conversations with the folks at Graffiti Pier, knowing in reality, this place cannot remain the way it is. Let's have a conversation about what's the best thing that can happen and what is the worst thing that can happen, because we're going to fall somewhere in the middle. And so we obviously want to fall on one side of that, but a lot of our work with folks is we never ask people actually what they want, because they're not going to get it. And there's just no way to give everybody what they want. and so a lot of the way we frame our conversations, our public engagement, our even the way that we talk about the design work itself is about values. What are the values? What are the priorities? What are the kind of larger visions and goals of a community, of a place, and their relationship to it? Because we can design around that. Change is going to happen, but if we are oriented towards the things that are most important, then we can perhaps introduce some change or prepare for the change that's inevitable, as long as we stay focused on the things that are most important to the larger group. And so the Graffiti Pier project, there's actually quite a bit of change that's being introduced and being prepared for, much of it out of our control by virtue of a changing climate and development pressure on adjacent parcels that our client doesn't own. But what we can do is create and define parameters around what's most important.
So I do want to talk more about the kind of Philadelphia project in a big picture way, but there's an interesting question that's come through from a Mojo the Monster 1. It's probably not his real name, but he has a very good question. He or she has a very good question here about the kind of mechanics of talking to the community in Philadelphia. It says, when you have conversations such as this with the stakeholders in the graffiti park, how do you extract the key ideas and words? Do you record and transcribe the conversation? What kind of questions do you ask? And I think this is interesting too, especially dealing with the kind of anonymity that a lot of these artists kind of require too. So.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that we always say is we never use the same methods twice. That engagement itself is a design project, and so Graffiti Pier. I mean, as I answer this, I want to kind of preface it by saying, we won't do it again, and it's something that not necessarily do it all the time, but because of the nature of the conversation of wanting folks to feel really comfortable, we actually were not recording them or even actively taking notes in the conversation. I mean, much like Olmsted himself, in this way, we were engaged in a conversation and recording mentally what was important. And so that was the nature of this particular task of making people feel comfortable, who, as I mentioned, are criminalized for what they're actually describing to us as their use of the site. So our method was casual conversations with folks. I mean, literally in bars, and then when we disseminated the concept plan at the end of the phase, which was only last month or so, we worked with some of the graffiti writers to develop a zine. So we made a physical zine. They contributed their own graffiti writing and pictures of pieces that they put up at the site itself. And we interspersed the graffiti writing and the photographs of their graffiti with the design work, and had a physical mail out that we gave each graffiti writer 3 or 4 copies, and then they mailed to their networks. And zines are very much a part of street art culture. So it's really about tapping into kind of the ritual and the culture of whatever constituency you're working in and kind of slipping into that. So hanging out in a bar and making a zine fits right in with kind of the rhythm of this community.
I think this is interesting. The kind of local investigation that you do, because I think that I can detect kind of in your work an interest in place. Like you mentioned, Lenox Avenue comes up again and again in your presentation. This kind of focus on the people and the places that you meet these people in Philadelphia is kind of important. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit about being a Southerner, and how that your familiarity with a place kind of shapes your outlook, your aesthetic, and your approach to the design.
Yeah, I mean, I spent the first half of my childhood in Louisiana, and what a place to grow up in, where your cul-de-sac, our cul-de-sac was the place of many a crawfish boil, and, the under the freeways was parade route, and just little pieces of everyday landscape can mean so much. And I remember actually when I was applying to graduate schools for landscape architecture, there was a couple of times in a couple of different applications, they asked you to describe your favorite landscape, designed landscape. And I was like, I don't know. Literally, I think I wrote about the underpass of a freeway. And so for me, the most important and meaningful places were probably to the outside world, if I pointed to them, meaningless and nothing remarkable. But for me, the experience of those places meant that I almost had a, kind of like a Du Bois double consciousness about it, that this place was really special and meaningful and beautiful to me. And so the question of design then, and having the agency of a designer in that context, the project becomes like elevating a place to match what people see it meaning in their minds. And for a lot of people, the discrepancy between those two things is much wider than others. If you live in a place where everything is well maintained and invested in, perhaps that discrepancy is actually more minimal. And so that's the fun part of design. That's the big project in my mind, about hearing people's stories and memories, and then looking at the physical conditions and saying, how do we express what they see as this value and make it in the physical realm?
And what's so interesting about that is it's kind of what you can see Olmsted developing as he's moving through the South, is that he does, as you mentioned in the talk, just develops or becomes very hardened in his opposition to what he sees. He develops, in the kind of parlance that we talk about now, kind of radical empathy. And I think that it's a amazing project to reintroduce this empathizing as a central part of design. So I have another question from Mojo the Monster, who's really lighting it up tonight with interesting questions here. And this I think fits in with what we've been talking about. He says, or she says, it could be she. How do you see the connection between travelogues, such as Olmsted's Cotton Kingdom, and the work of landscape architects? Would there be relevance to contemporary landscape architects to engage in similar traveling and writing?
It's a really good question. So I have been kind of doing somewhat of I'm writing a book about this and about my travel and reflecting on the relevance of Olmsted. And part of that project has been looking at the genre of travel writing. And actually, it's interesting, Olmsted kind of developed his own lane in this genre at the time. A lot of what he's doing is very expository. So it's not quite journalism and it's not quite travel writing. It's actually both. And that is somewhat of an innovation at the time that Olmsted introduces. And I do think for landscape architecture, it's an interesting intersection. Are we journalists? Are we storytellers? It's this kind of, there's a lot of expository writing, but there's also a lot of artful. He's also taking kind of a literary stance here. And I think that when we think about the stories that our landscapes are telling and how didactic or not we want them to be, I think there is something to reflect on about moving through places. I mean, we are travel writers in a sense as landscape architects, working in these different sites and reading these different places, analyzing them and projecting some story about them. So there's very much a parallel in travel writing and landscape architecture. That's why I think that there is a methodological proposition here. It's very much about the kind of roots and methods of travel writing and journalism, especially when we're talking about memory and history and sites of historical significance, because the narrative that we choose to tell, there's so many narratives in any particular, place. And so what rises to the top, how you tell it. I mean, I'm teaching a seminar right now on Cotton Kingdom, and the first assignment that I have the students do is a literary analysis, looking at Olmsted's text from a literary perspective. What is he choosing in terms of syntax and sentence structure, and using that as a departure then to think about what the main argument is that Olmsted's describing about the place. So I think there's a lot there to think about.
I agree, and this is why I always encourage my students to write a lot to it. I mean, it sharpens your mind, I think, and that would be something that Olmsted would agree with. So I want to switch gears for a second here and pick up on something that you mentioned in your talk about the quote, the traditional media of landscape architecture and how that tends towards a kind of erasure. And I'm going to couple this with a question that's come in from Todd Gannon, which has to do with, I think, this kind of also an idea of the kind of bureaucratic inertia of a profession and what can happen. He writes, "It's interesting and discouraging that that Olmsted Sr.'s son, F.L. Olmsted Jr., did not follow in his father's footsteps. He spoke in favor of segregation while director of the Federal Town Planning Division and participated in the construction of over 100,000 units of segregated housing during World War II. So even though he inherited the firm, he took it in a very kind of different direction. So I was wondering if you could comment on that."
Yeah, I mean, it is an unfortunate turn, and that's why I think that the question about the toggling of scales is actually really important to the training and practice of landscape architecture. That telling the story of the roots of the profession and making sure that precedents like the Cotton Kingdom are present is important to understanding how our profession can be both a tool and a weapon. The junior, inherited the firm, but didn't inherit this practice of reading the kind of like wider considerations of the society. Olmsted was so taken and so present in, analyzing these wider considerations of society and of the land that junior just did not adopt. And what that transfer of knowledge and skills is something that I want to look further into, and how that dropped off in the handing off of the baton. And it's unfortunate because we do have such a power to wield that it can also, be the weapon that inflicts the kind of trauma we've seen that the planning and design professions, honestly, I've been complicit in for decades. And so this project for me started years ago, but it's been interesting since the murder of George Floyd, how much people are asking the question of our profession, like every profession, actually, frankly, it's happening in every industry. But I think it's made me revisit this question of what happened and where did we go wrong, having had this kind of start as a profession. But I agree that it is unfortunate. It was an unfortunate kind of turn. And to your question, John, about the traditional media, I mean, that's what's so interesting about it. They're so ubiquitous, the elements of landscape and Biennale, but they seem so inconsequential potentially. But when you look at cities, and frankly, when you go and you visit the places that Olmsted visited, I mean, there's freeways that crisscross them. There's parks and plazas on top of and burial grounds. I mean, there's one site in particular I was just thinking about today where Olmsted describes this really moving ceremony of a young Black child. And when I went to the site, I couldn't find it. I was standing in it. It was an asphalt parking lot below a freeway. And there are, in fact, hundreds, if not thousands of people below that asphalt. But there's no sign or no marker, and another burial ground that he describes in Savannah, where it's a beautiful landscape architected plaza square, I would call it, with the gazebo and beautiful oak trees. But there are bodies below the earth, and Olmsted documents that well. And so that's, the traditional media then become the weapon for destruction or for a peaceful recasting of the story of the place.
So to kind of further this, if we're going to take the murder of George Floyd as a rallying call, should, and make some serious changes to the profession and to a lot of things in the United States. As both an academic or an educator and as a working professional, where do you see the changes happening? Where do you see the kind of groundswell coming from?
At that moment in time, and still is, was and remains very emotional for me, because these were things that I felt very alone in thinking about all of my career in landscape architecture. I felt, in the 3 years that I was educated at the GSD, I'm not sure I had a single Black writer assigned to me in any syllabus. And, I would mention that back then, but the response I got was frankly like, well, you're studying landscape architecture, what do you expect? And that was not that long ago. So I'm trying to remember, like, these are things and questions that I was already thinking about, and not get too kind of pulled by the immediacy and the kind of energy that other people are finding. Because for me, it's a very long game. I have to keep that, and I've had to use that energy, and I have to keep that into the future. This is not a moment in time for me. This is my whole life. So that's been really difficult to do. But what I have found energizing and heartening to see, frankly, is students, and how much they are pushing their professors, their employers, I am so heartened by the investment that they're making to educate themselves, because we don't have a curriculum in landscape architecture that addresses these things, and they are fashioning it themselves. And that just, for me, it gives me energy and keeps me going.
I completely agree with you. I continue to be impressed by the students, especially the students who come to this profession through, non-traditional routes, which is maybe a good thing for the profession, that we attract people that, didn't believe they wanted to be landscape architects since they were 6 or something like that, that they find the scenic route, as you so well put. Well, this we're drawing to the end here, and your kind of the statement about students, I think, fits in well with the last question. But before I ask that question, I want to acknowledge that Mojo the Monster has outed themselves as Molly McKay, so thank you, Molly, and we won't hold your YouTube name against you. Thank you for those excellent questions. So the final question here is from Yabasera Tedesi. She writes, I am a freshman majoring in architecture. I am also an Ethiopian girl, so seeing you and all your accomplishments is so inspiring. How have you found your voice and purpose in this field?
Ooh, good question. It wasn't easy. There was a moment John, I don't even think you probably know about this, but there was a moment where I was not going to finish my degree. And I just felt like there wasn't a place for me. And I'm interested in landscape architecture and design, clearly, but I was being told by mentors and faculty that maybe this wasn't the field that you actually are interested in. Maybe because they'd never seen this kind of approach or work. I don't know. At the time, I didn't know it was possible myself, so I wasn't really challenging that. I just started to think, okay, maybe they're right. And it happened to just kind of be a single person, that a faculty member, that told me it was okay. That, okay, maybe it's not that common or whatever, your interests, but there is a space for you in this field. And so my path has not been fun in a lot of ways. It's been very, 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 very challenging and very hard. Having said that, I also have people like Walter Hood if Walter Hood had not been in landscape architecture, I wouldn't have been here, frankly. Seeing him and the kind of work that he did made me feel like it could be possible, but he didn't even have that. And so I also, while I can talk about how hard it was for me, it was not as hard for me as it was for the people that predate me. There are 12 licensed Black landscape architects that are women in the United States of America. So I often ask people, like, what percent do you think of licensed landscape architects are Black women? And usually people say like 2%. And if that's your guess, you're off by a factor of 1,000 because it's 0.002. So yeah, so 0.02. So it's not easy, but and oftentimes when I tell the story of how I, my professional journey, it's like I don't really recommend it for others. It's like not for the faint of heart, but there are a lot of people that are being educated now that have a drive and an energy, and like I hope that this profession just flourishes and grows its impact and influence on the world, and I think being a more diverse profession is central to our ability to do that.
Well, I'm very glad, for one, that you stuck with it, and I'm sure that there will be people who come after you who are going to be glad that you stuck with it as well. So thank you so much, Sara. Inspiring as always, tremendous work. Really wonderful conversation. Great to catch up after after a few years. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I'm so happy that this is something that you and I are able to share, and thank you to all the people out there somewhere for engaging.
Wonderful. Well, that's it for tonight. Thanks again to our guests, and thanks to all of our viewers. Good night. I'm John Davis. Good night and good luck.